we often talk about, what's different about leading in India, leading in Japan. Well, actually, and this is another revelation when I wrote the book, um, there are more similarities. When you talk about game-changing, effective leadership, I think it's timeless and borderless. Again, across arenas, go back 2,000 years, whether we're talking about Greek philosophers who thought about leadership or today in politics and arts and science and business, sports, whatever, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, there are certain rules about effective leadership that cross all boundaries.
All right, welcome to a very special episode of Tokyo Recruiters. I'm joined by Paul Dupuis. Thank
Hi,
you.
Levi. Great to be here.
And first of all, thank you to InnoHive, to Juanis and Axel for letting us use this amazing studio. Very excited to be recording here. And I just wanted to share maybe with the audience a little bit about what brought you to Japan originally. I know it's a unique story that you get into in your book. So could you set the stage for us just a little bit?
Well, thank you. Hey, I think we've all had unique paths to get to Japan, but yeah, mine. I have special memories. I left Windsor, Ontario, Canada, my hometown, first time on an airplane in 1990, and I flew to Osaka. And you have to think in 1990 that was pre-internet, and Osaka in 1990, particularly being the second city, wasn't very international. And certainly, there were very few people that spoke English. So I arrived with a backpack and a working holiday visa, no job, my life savings after buying the ticket, were about $300 Canadian. So I started my journey sleeping on a park bench in Osaka. That was night one in Japan.
So you didn't know where you were going to stay when you got here?
No, one of the great things about being young is being fearless and curious. I think that's kind of a running theme maybe in our conversation today is to protect that spirit of being fearless and curious. But I hadn't thought ahead just beyond I'm going to Japan.
Wow. So from sleeping on a park bench in Japan to eventually running a $1 billion USD company, that's quite a trajectory. And I'm excited to jump into how exactly that happened. But I guess going back, what originally brought you to Japan, and what was the first kind of move that you made after sleeping the night on that park bench?
Well, I'll tell you what, a lot has happened since sleeping on the park bench to leading, as you said, $1 billion plus company in recruitment in Japan. Well, first of all, coming to Japan, my in Canada, or at least where I'm from, when people graduate from university, if you're going to go somewhere and do a backpacking trip, it's typically Europe. And I've always kind of been interested in Asia. And I've also kind of been the one who wanted to go the other way. When everyone wants to go left, I tend to want to go right. That's just something about me. I'm not sure where it came from. But I was also quite interested in the martial arts. So I wanted to do karate in Japan. And that was kind of the image, of going to Japan and doing the real thing. I had studied it in Canada. But I was really excited about the opportunity to go to Japan and do the real thing in a dojo in Japan. And I ended up choosing Osaka, which in hindsight was a great choice.
And what was the first, I guess, step that you took, when you have this world of possibilities? Obviously, you're here for karate and to do martial arts, but what was the first step on your journey once you woke up on that park bench? Like, what was that first thing you jumped into?
I had to find a place to stay. This is really basic, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, find some shelter and food and so on, and friendship and all that. So I found a place. Now, if I tell this story to people in Osaka, they always laugh because the place I ended up landing was the slum of Osaka. It's called Kamagasaki Nishinari Dobutsenmai. Anybody from Kansai knows this place, and they tend to find it funny that I landed there. I found a place which was called the Hotel Sun Plaza. I'll never forget it. It had a great name. It was the only thing that was written in English in that neighborhood, and I thought I'll go there. It turns out it was kind of a flop house for construction workers, the day workers. So it was a 3 tatami mat room. You open the door and there's the wall, shared washroom, shared shower, and so on. And it was 300 yen a night.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's where I started. Little known story, and the folks who have been in Japan a very long time will know this. Shortly after I arrived was the biggest riot in modern history in Japan. It's called the Nishinari Bodo, the Nishinari Riot, and it's worth checking it out. You just run a search on YouTube. It was basically an uprising of these construction workers, the day workers, against society in general. The police, the local, we'll call them the mafia, but the local folks who are running kind of the dodgy business of day workers, construction workers. And it was violent. They burnt a police station to the ground.
Wow.
Cars were flipped upside down, Molotov cocktails. I was in Japan, really, only a couple weeks, and I was literally smack in the middle of a riot.
That's incredible. I mean, riots anywhere are pretty scary. I can't imagine what it's like in Japan, which is such a peaceful place most of the time. Did you get were you involved at all with this, or what was the closest that you got to that?
I was in the thick of it because where I was staying in this sort of little
Flop
flop
house.
house, and I knew one route to the station,
Mhm.
to the Mito-Suji line, which is the main kind of line in Osaka. And I had to go straight through where kind of the worst part of the riot was. That was the only entrance I knew of, kind of had that one route.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I had to kind of battle my way through to get to the station. And it was messy. It was a messy time. And I came back the next morning, and it was like something out of a movie scene. It was cars flipped upside down, burned out. There was smoke everywhere. It was the aftermath of a riot.
Wow.
And people often will ask me, why didn't you go home after that? But, it also reminded me that there is let's call it the Discovery Channel version of Japan, or anywhere for that matter. And then there's the other side. And I think where we come from, whether it's Hawaii or, where I'm from in Canada or Japan, I think every place has its uniqueness and has different sides. And this was a side of Japan I was really interested in learning more about and exploring. And I'm really glad I stayed.
Wow. I mean, that is a unique origin story, I would say. Like, in so many ways, I have not had someone on here who's talked about riots at all or sleeping on park benches. And then to have someone, of your standing basically and what you've achieved, it it makes sense maybe that you stayed through all of that right after seeing that part. It sounds like it almost made you fall in love with Japan even more to see this almost ugly side of society. But I'm curious, like, when you entered into the professional world, where did you start in Osaka, or did you move to Tokyo at that point, or how did you start to find a job in the first place, and what was that like?
Yeah. So, well, the word professional is a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I think when you're making a living and
Yeah.
you're paying your way, you're on the road to independence and professionalism, let's say. So,
Mm.
at 22 years old, arriving with life savings, I needed to find a job. And in 1990 in Osaka, as a native English speaker, teaching English
Mhm.
was the first option. And so
Mm.
I did that. I taught kindergarten kids right up to university professors at an English school in Eikaiwa. And
Mhm.
that was great because it allowed me then to pursue my passion of karate in the evenings. So I would teach during the day and I would do karate in the evening. And then off to the izakaya, and that's where I started to learn Japanese by ear. And of course,
Mhm.
Kansai Ben, the Osaka dialect,
Nice.
which I speak. And then, fast forward, I had an opportunity to get a role in a public high school in Osaka. There's the JET program, of course, we all know
Mhm.
about, where the Ministry of Education brings people over to work in schools. But this was actually run by the Osaka School Board. And they were hiring a very select few teachers each year. I was really lucky to get that role. And even more so in hindsight, I was, again, bit of twist of fate maybe. I was placed in a school in Osaka, which is infamous as being one of the worst schools in the area. At least at that time, it was called Matsubara High School. And
Mm.
it's deep South Osaka and kind of, a lot of social issues in that, a very blue collar area, and the kids coming from tough families, broken families, and so on. So again, I got to see another very real side of Japan. That was an amazing experience.
Hmm.
And then fast forward again, 1995, the big earthquake in Kobe. So I was in Osaka at that time, and that literally kind of shook up me in many ways, but kind of, was a wake up call for me. And that's where actually when I think about it now, that's where the word purpose
Mm.
started to be born. because I started to think, why are we here? When you see that tragedy firsthand, because I was there the next day and volunteering with my friends, and yeah, when you just see the devastation, it makes you rethink your whole purpose. Originally, I wanted to be a lawyer. I was going to go back to Canada. I got into law school. I deferred. I was going to stay in Japan a little bit more and go back and become a lawyer. And then I thought, why do I want to do that? And when I thought about it, the fast cars, the big house, the money and all that actually was meaningless when I was, going to be in Kobe the day after the earthquake. So I decided to become a teacher. So I went back to Vancouver in 1995 after the earthquake. And I got into grad school in Vancouver, and I got licensed as a high school teacher in British Columbia. Still have it, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just, was there any point, because you're talking about purpose, you're talking about seeing this disaster, seeing some ugly kind of tragedies as well leading up to this point, and then realizing that you wanted to teach people after this. And I'm not hearing any kind of like connection with becoming a CEO of running $1 billion corporation. And at what point did you realize, like, did you have a moment when you were like, I want to now become a CEO, or did you kind of fall into it? I know we're fast forwarding just a little bit, but I'm really curious, how did this pan out?
There was no aha, hallelujah moment where I wanted to be. In fact, to be honest with you, I never really had an ambition to be a CEO. That wasn't on my roadmap at all. So that's a lesson maybe for everyone, all of us. Never say never. There is something, and I've learned this especially in the past year since I've graduated from the corporate world, and I can share more of that with you later. But when you are open to things, the universe brings you things. That's been proven to me time and time again. I'm very fortunate. So back from Vancouver, then to Osaka, stayed in education. And then for all the old school recruiters out there, or those who have studied the history of recruitment in Japan, you'll know the story of the OGs, as we call them, the original recruiting companies in Japan back in the day. Now, we all know about East, West, and so on. There was one called Wall Street Associates, one of the originals. And there are a lot of Wall Street Associates graduates out there in the form of N-World and beyond. And there are some great leaders out there in the recruitment world. So I joined Wall Street Associates. I left the world of education. I left the stability of being a sensei. I was married. I had 2 young boys at that point. And here's another really important lesson. In life, we go down the path, we hit forks in the road. It's really important to ask for advice and opinions from people that, people you trust and admire and so on. But sometimes you're going to hear things you don't want to hear. Like, hey, you're crazy to quit that stable job and go this way. And, what I really wanted to hear was go for it. And there were a few people, very select few, that said, hey, why not? One life to live.
How old were you at the time?
I was, 36.
Wow.
So you could say officially I started in the world of business as a newbie at 36.
Wow.
With 2 young boys.
Wow.
And I left the stable world of education to lead the startup of Wall Street Associates in Osaka. This was before anybody had gone there. Kansai, West Japan was like this unexplored frontier. And so, had to find an office. Had to, I remember ordering the desks, and at that time, the founder, Nick Johnson, and I were literally building the desks in this service office. We hired people. Fast forward again, we built a successful business, had about 40 people at its peak. Then I also led the opening of Nagoya. So we had 2 offices. In the meantime, Wall Street in Tokyo had grown from about 20 people to well over 100. So at our peak, I think we were somewhere around 200 people. And then, quite a famous story in the world of recruitment, we ended up being acquired by N Japan, one of the largest job boards here in Japan, listed Tokyo Prime. And so that was a real, turning point. So back to your point about professional. Well, I think as a teacher, I was professional in many ways. But we talk about business, stepping into recruitment, leading, West Japan for Wall Street Associates from a pure zero startup, no clients, no candidates, no knowledge of the industry was an amazing start. And by the way, you had somebody on your podcast recently, Jennifer Shinkai.
Yes, yeah.
Jennifer Shinkai actually is in many ways a legend herself.
Mhm.
She came down to Osaka, and at that time she was the training manager for Wall Street Associates.
Hmm.
And we gathered in a room for 1 week, and we had Jennifer Shinkai's 101 boot camp of recruitment. And we learned the nuts and bolts of recruitment, and then we launched from there.
Wow. So how did you get connected to Nick Johnson, and how did this opportunity to, I mean, I don't know if you understood the gravity of that you're building basically the foundation of Japan's one of the biggest companies for recruitment in Japan, right? Eventually becoming in Japan, but how did you get this opportunity to do this? And did you know what the future had in store for how big it was going
Mm, mm.
to be built? What was the vision like?
You know, I'd say most of the amazing opportunities that I've had along my journey, and I think most people would agree when you kind of rewind back and look at your journey from there to here, came through relationships. We talk about this a lot.
Mhm.
Relationships are the most important thing. They really are. And so I had a friend, a Canadian friend,
Mhm.
the Canadian community,
Mm.
who was working with Wall Street Associates at that time. And he said, hey, our founder, Nick Johnson, is really eager to look at West Japan expansion, and you're the guy in Kansai. There weren't many, non-Japanese folks in Kansai who could speak the language, who could get stuff done,
Mm.
who were a bit competitive, and so on. So I probably ticked a lot of the boxes. Then I met Nick, and I would say to you, I wasn't that interested in the beginning
Mm.
because I didn't know what recruitment was. I had no idea what this thing was.
Mhm.
This is really the early days. And so when I sat with Nick and some of the team from Wall Street, and I heard about this business, which is really about taking someone who's looking for a job. And by the way, when you're looking for a job, we know it's a very stressful time of life. It's one of the most important moves you're going to make in your life, right? Professionally and personally. And then you have a company that's looking for great people. And as a recruiter, you're in between. And your role is to make that best match. And when you do it right, it's virtuous. In other words, the candidate is happy, the client is happy. You hear thank you from the client, you hear thank you from the candidate, and you get paid.
This is an ideal world. Yeah.
Well, and I think
That's the
and this is a message for anyone who's thinking about getting into recruiting or in recruitment, always remember the purpose. Come back to purpose.
Mm.
It's one thing to do this with a short-term mentality, to make a placement and collect the fee, but actually it's a relationship, it's a partnership. And we took that stance from day one.
Mm.
And that investment in building partnerships and relationships, not just a vendor, not just a transactional approach, really caring about the candidate and the client ended up being a secret for our success.
Mm.
We had no idea. I wouldn't say that. If you asked Nick, he would say, oh yeah, we're going to be big. We're going to, we'll be the biggest in Japan, if not in Asia, if not in the world. But I don't think anyone expected that we would grow to that level and be acquired by a Japanese listed company and a job board, not even a recruitment company.
Mm.
So that was a really interesting outcome. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. I think, I mean, looking back, they say the dots connect, right?
Yeah.
But I think
yeah,
a lot of people probably at this point, you know, looking at your story, you were 36 years old, and basically your experience professionally was you were a teacher in Japan and in Canada, and then going on for the next, I guess, how long were you in the corporate world for?
Oh, went on till, let's see. Well, I just turned 57, so until 56.
Okay.
So officially, I graduated at 56.
So it was just about 20 years then.
Exactly 20 years. I
Wow.
had a 20-year run in that,
Wow.
let's say the corporate world, from kind of a zero start. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've gone on now to write a book about leadership as well, and it seems like maybe this came naturally to you, but I'm curious, at what point did you realize like maybe you're cut out for leadership? Did you take some kind of course or read a book that kind of inspired you to want to do this, or did you find that even growing up you were taking a leadership role, or what was your journey like as a new leader, basically?
When it's a wonderful question. When you talk to leaders, and I did that when I wrote my book, I talked to a lot of leaders I asked basically the same question: when did you know?
Mm,
And no one could tell me I knew at that moment. It's kind of a gradual thing that sort of happens over time. And it also brings up this question of whether leaders are born or whether they can be built, created. I
mm,
absolutely believe there's no such thing as born leadership. It's
mm,
a muscle that can be built and learned, but you got to do the work. It
mm,
takes hard work, like any muscle or ability or skill. But, in the book, and I talk about this, in hindsight, in retrospect, and that was the wonderful thing about writing a book because you look back at your journey. When I was a little kid on the local ice rink, pond, playing hockey, or on the field playing baseball, whatever, you would gather on a Saturday morning at the local park, whatever sport you play, right? And the kids gather there together. Well, there's no hierarchy, right? Maybe the older kids kind of take control, but there's no appointed leader. Someone typically steps up and says, okay, let's pick teams. And then the teams are picked.
mm,
And then you start playing. And then in hockey, for example, you say, oh, that was a tripping. Who's gonna decide? Well, someone will step up. So what ends up happening is leaders typically emerge. They're the first ones to pick up, the ball, or the first one to say, let's go. They're the ones who arrange things. Let's meet on Saturday at 9 o'clock.
mm,
And when I look back, I realize that I typically would do that. I like to gather people together to do stuff.
mhm,
Happen to be ice hockey and other sports and so on. So that's really, I think, where the foundation of leadership was born for me. Of course, I was influenced by people around me. Absolutely, my dad, who was a
mm,
teacher, by the way, but a leader in his own right, in the way he carried himself, the way he behaved, the way he was engaged with the community, and so on. My hockey coaches, the church, which I was quite involved in growing up as well. Um, I think there's so many different influences, and I can't put my finger on one particular person or experience. I think it was something gradual over time.
mm. And how do you develop that muscle of leadership?
So there was the gradual process, of course, but then making a conscious decision to say, okay, now I really want to build this. Let's call it a craft,
Mm,
because leadership is more of a craft. It's less science. It's much more art, right? And I talk about that in the book. It really is a blend between science and art, but nobody's going to remember the leader for the science
mhm,
at the end of the day, right? So um, that's I think that moment where I decided that I really want to lead people was probably when I got involved in recruitment and I had this opportunity to build something from scratch. And then also realizing that I also had a huge responsibility to ensure the folks that I'm working with could have a livelihood.
mm,
So it's one thing to be responsible for arranging something or gathering people together, but it's another thing to be responsible for ensuring that they get paid
yeah,
every month. And these are people with, in some cases, families and so on. So that responsibility, and then I realized I really liked that. There's pressure that comes with it.
mm.
I actually quite liked it. I found it highly motivating.
I wanna talk about the peak basically of when you were managing. How many people were you managing at the peak, I guess, of
Well,
your
if you go through my career, I mean,
yeah.
the biggest number would have, when I was in India, I was CEO of Randstad in India. We had
Mm,
75,000 people under my responsibility. Whether you have 5 people or 75,000 people, the responsibility is the same, to ensure that you provide
mm,
an environment where people are safe,
mhm,
physically and psychologically, as we learned during COVID, by the way.
mm,
Um, and then also that you create a space where people can shine. And of
mhm,
course, make a living. That's all connected together to feel good about yourself as well, right?
mhm,
As a professional. So in India, I had 75,000 people across 75 offices. And India is such a dynamic, diverse country and a very emotional culture. And that was for me one of the most difficult times and the most rewarding times, the 4 years in India. Partly because I was way out of my comfort zone. I mean, Japan became a comfort zone, and suddenly parachuting in India to be the CEO of this massive operation, so complex, and it was a struggling operation. And then COVID came. So being a captain of a ship when one of your missions is to keep people safe, that was a really tough time.
Mm.
But I grew a lot as well. And I think, there's this wonderful Japanese proverb. It says, as the rain falls, the roots grow stronger. Ame ga futte ji ga katamaru. It's a wonderful phrase. And I think it is true that, we do get stronger from those experiences, but we make the choice. You can also go the other way. So I think it's also important to embrace those moments and learn from them. And being in India helped me do it. And that's when I wrote the book as well.
Mm. So we've kind of danced around the book a little bit, but
Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit about what people can expect when they're opening this up or checking it out?
Sure.
Online?
Well, a disclaimer.
Yeah.
I'd never written a book before. And I remember what happened was a couple people suggested to me, hey, Paul, you should write a book. The first default reaction was, I'm not a writer. Lesson number one, you can be anything you want to be. And I have to kind of drink my own medicine on this one. If someone says to you, you should write a book and you never thought about it and you don't consider yourself a writer, well, why not give it a shot? You should be a musician. Well, I don't know how to play. Well, you can learn how to play an instrument. This is the beauty of being human. We can decide to do it. So I had enough people say to me, you should write a book. Okay, pen to paper. The process of writing a book is tough. I won't lie to you. I mean, it took a while, but I decided to come back to purpose. Why do I want to write the book? And what do I want the book to be? What don't I want it to be? So simply put, I made a one-pager. I said, all right, I don't want this book to be dry, theoretical. It's not a book that would be used in an MBA class, although I'm finding that some are starting to want to use it, which is interesting. No diagrams, no 9 boxes, no theories, and so on. I want it to be real, digestible, full of stories, engaging. And that was my true north when I wrote the book. And as I started to write and I got deep into it, I started to go a waver off that. And I had a diagram. No, I want to put that diagram. No, hang on. I said I wouldn't do that. Back to the purpose, back to the true north. So in the end, the book is really, it's stories. Not only about my own journey, but it's in there. I talk a bit about the Osaka experience in more detail in there. I talk about my time in India and beyond, the ice rinks in Canada, and just different things. But also leaders that I've observed over the years across arenas, genres, business, sports, politics, arts, famous leaders that we all know. And my kind of observations and thoughts on that. I have a lot of quotes in there, some of my favorite quotes as well. Each chapter finishes with golden nuggets because one thing I've learned about leaders tend to have short attention spans. Good to have a summary, an executive summary at the end of every chapter. Yeah. But the book is based on 5 E's. And these are, it's interesting when you look at leadership frameworks and models and formulas. If you walk into a bookstore, you can find a whole wall of books on leadership. And that's now, today, right? If you rewind back 2,000 years or more, the Greek philosophers were talking about leadership, and they were saying essentially the same things that are in the books that we see today. Okay, so this reminds me of Isaac Newton's quote, "We see further when we stand on the shoulders of giants." Right? And that's essentially what we see with leadership thought nowadays. And that's what I did. I looked at all the leadership models that I'd been influenced by. I'll name a couple. One is the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, and he talks about level 5 leadership, also introduced to me by Nick Johnson. That became our Bible. That's the book I gave to all my leaders throughout my career and my journey. And we used it as a framework. Looking at companies went from good to great. Leadership was core. The Blue Ocean Strategy. And there's one more book, Pour Your Heart Into It by Howard Schultz, the Starbucks story, where he talks about how did they become number one in the world in this highly competitive industry. Red ocean, let's talk recruitment for a minute. No differentiation. It's all the same, regardless of which sign you have up on the wall. How do you win? He said, we win 1 cup at a time. That was my hallelujah moment. I didn't have 75,000 people working for me in India. I had 1 person at a time. So it was 1 candidate at a time. It was 1 client at a time, 1 engagement at a time. When you really put your heart into it, like he says in the book, amazing things can happen. So from that, I crafted what I would call, a formula that's built on the back of others, and it's called the E5. There's 5 E's. First one is envision. So the greatest leaders over history, again, across arenas and genres, start with a powerful vision. And the vision is rooted in why, not what or, all the tactical stuff. It's why. Why do we exist? And the why has to touch the heart first, then the mind. And a lot of leaders kind of mix that up. And I'm guilty of that. Go straight to the head. KPIs, conversion ratios, numbers, profitability, EBITDA, whatever it is. But actually, you need to start with the purpose, something that catches the heart of everyone in the room, a greater purpose. Then once you've got that, then the next challenge is to go out the door and express it, the second E, express. And what we know and what we're even learning today, I guess, as we sit here, gone are the days where there was really one way to express your thoughts to people. You would meet them in person and speak to them. Well, now we have podcasts. We have social media. Of course, there is the in-person, there's the town halls and so on. So I'll call this the omni-channel approach to communication, similar to e-commerce. So leveraging the multiple ways of communicating with people to reach their hearts and their minds. So that's express. And that's hard. You need help. I needed help with that. So I asked my communications team, my experts in PR and communications, to help me out with that. Crafting the message in a way everybody would be touched. Now you need to touch them. Well, that's the 30. Excited. Excite, right? Get people excited about the message. So you've got a powerful vision. You're expressing it in a way that reaches the four corners of the organization, and now they're getting excited. This is a moment of truth because people start to lean in and say, and the knees start to bounce, and people want to be part of it, and they start raising their hand and volunteering or sharing ideas. And then the fourth E, and this to me is the most critical, and I think many leaders never get to this E, and that is leader as enabler, enable. So the most effective leaders come in every day, whether virtually or physically, with one purpose: to enable everyone around them to shine, to be the best true version of themselves, to smash it, right? And rather than pushing down, lifting up, remove barriers. Sometimes that means pushing, pulling, challenging, patting on the back, maybe tough love. But anyway, that's all enabling. Once you've done that, then it's the final E. And the final E, this is since the days of Aristotle when he talked about leadership to today, the ultimate measurement of effective leadership, that's execute. Bring that vision to life for measurable impact. As you can see it. And so I looked at this as kind of 5 wheels. And each of the wheel standing alone isn't enough. It can, one, envision, that's great, having a vision, but sitting in a room having a vision doesn't change the world. But when they all come together, interlocking, and then that creates a movement. And that was my final kind of conclusion when I wrote the book, is that great leaders create movements. So it's called the E5 movement.
Wow. I didn't realize the story behind that, but yeah, thinking about the position that you were in, right, as a leader, and you're managing 75,000 people. What was the movement? You were talking about how the company maybe wasn't in the best, or at least the branch in India wasn't in the best condition when you first came in. So how did you unite them with that purpose, and what was that movement that, the transformation, I guess, that you were a part of?
That's in the book. That's a good chunk of the book. Yeah. So to sum it up in a brief way, I would say, well, first of all, I think that if you have a group of people, whether it's, again, 5 people or 75,000 people, if they're not heading in the same direction, arm in arm, and believing in the direction, in the purpose, and in the leadership, then you're certainly not going to get there, right? That's a given. And that's what we had in India. We had a leadership team which was heading in several different directions. Therefore, we were going nowhere. So first we need to crystallize the direction, starting with why, right? So that was really the biggest challenge. It also called for courageous decisions. If I go back to good to great, and I kind of, let's say, applied these principles, that first, do we have the right people on the bus? To build a high-performing team, you need to have the right people on your bus. And these are people not just with the right skills, but with the right values. I'd say even more importantly, right? Then the next question is, are they in the right seat on your bus? If the answer is yes, they should be on our bus. Okay, they're one of us. They have the right values and so on. Okay, good. Are they in the right seat? And this is often where leaders kind of mess up, and we put people on the bus, but we put them in the wrong seat so they can't shine. Go back to the enabling leader. One of your roles is to make sure right people are on the bus in the right seat so they can shine. And so that was really the first 6 months or so. And that called for courageous decisions. I needed to have several key people get off the bus and replace with people who we needed on the bus. And then take the bus in a direction that would get everybody excited.
Yeah, it sounds tough to have to make that decision.